I would be shocked if there was anybody who didn't consider the Blue Album to be their favorite Weezer album. That's a good look. Right there. Get the Mastodon poster in there.
I was just talking about them yesterday, actually. Hey, welcome to Feedback Def. I'm Sabby Reyes Kulkarni, the apostate music journalist, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be talking about the 30th anniversary of Weezer's first album. The Blue Album was released on May 10th, 1994. And who better to discuss this album than the one and only Weezer, Steve? Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored. I've known you a long time, and Weezer's been a big part of that relationship for a long time.
Well, and I mean, I seriously can't think of anybody better to talk about this. So let's go back to the beginning. Talk us through your first discovery of Weezer and how you responded.
Um, I actually came in, I feel like it was a little bit late. Not super late in the grand scheme of things, but um, that the album came out in May and it didn't really get traction until the fall. Like it took a bit of time before I guess it was Buddy Holly that really pushed it into the mainstream. But the Undone, the first single, didn't really have much traction. But I'd say it was probably, early in my, what, 94 would have been 4, 5, 6, my freshman year of high school. So, I started school in September, and it was probably early in September where, people started talking about Undone, and then I started hearing it on the radio and MTV. That video is burned into my memory. It was such a unique and interesting and hilarious like way for a band to introduce themselves to the world. Spike Jones directed it before Spike Jones had really taken off as something big. Um, so it was, the fall of '94 when I really dug my teeth into it. And honestly, I think my first exposure to the album itself, um, outside of just, airplay on radio or MTV was my friend Scott, who Scott, who was a longtime bandmate of mine. Um, I My memory is that he ripped either from a cassette to a cassette or from a CD to a cassette and gave me a cassette of the album. Um, and I'm sure if I started digging around, I could find the actual cassette. The weird thing is, in my memory, is that the songs were out of order on the cassette. So it probably wasn't a direct cassette to cassette transfer. For some reason, they were out of order. That I know for sure because I remember finally buying the CD at some point that year and being like, that song doesn't go there, and this song doesn't go there, and um, but I, played that cassette nonstop. Like it was just, I went to a high school where there was no busing. Everybody walked to school. It's a really small community. And I remember just carrying my Walkman with my old freaking over the ear, like headed old school headphones and just walking to and from school every day, listening to that cassette nonstop. And there were probably, I feel like the cassette had other stuff after the Weezer album that wasn't Weezer, which seems weird as well. I probably should have looked into that before I started talking to you, but yeah, my biggest memory is just being enamored with it instantly. And obviously, as a 14-year-old going on 15, I would say I was 15 when I really dug my teeth into it.
Right, because your
That's
birthday's in September.
Yeah, exactly. So that is, that's a really impressionable age for anybody to absorb music. And that album at that point in my life, and just with my personality at the time and the things I was into and the music I was into, it I just kind of it took over my life in a way that nothing really since has ever kind of done. Like it really changed the trajectory of me personally as a human being. It might be a little bit uh, hyperbolic, but as a musician, for sure, like it steered my songwriting and it steered my the interest of what I like to listen to in a completely 90-degree like tangent from where I was previously listening to. Um, I grew up essentially in the 80s and early 90s. And so, I grew up listening to,
Guns N' Roses would have been
yep,
on your like high on your palette at that moment still, correct?
100%. Yeah. I mean, that in 94, 95, Guns N' Roses had kind of fell off the face of the earth. Like, Use Your Illusion was already 4 years old at that point. And so, like, they were not much of anything at that point. But that's, the story I often tell about how I started to play guitar was I was 11 years old and my brother stuck a guitar in my hand and he taught me the the intro to Golden Earrings Radar Love, the bump 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 bump, because it's really easy to play on a guitar, um, which I suppose is actually a bass line. Um, and then he taught me like Led Zeppelin, like the Lemon Song, which is a really kind of simple riff
Like
to play. Yep, yep.
yeah.
So, that's what I was listening to in 91, 92 was a lot of classic rock, uh, a lot of like Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Metallica's Black Album had just come out in 91. Um, so that was kind of my taste was like light metal. It's not like I was listening to Slayer at that point in my life, but and then just a lot of guitar heavy blues based stuff and grunge hit and then Nirvana I was kind of a fan, but I still don't own Nevermind. It's not like that album ever had an impact on me really, other than just the mass appeal of that band. So it was a lot of what I was hearing on the radio was mainly my music taste. And so it was, grunge for lack of a better term, and then the stuff that I was playing along to on guitar. And then when Weezer came and it was completely out of left field, like that sound was, and I still feel like it is pretty unique. They've spawned thousands of bands that sound the same. But I feel like at the time they really were doing something that nobody else had really done in a unique way. Like when I say they, and when I say they, I really mean Rivers. He was really wearing his influences on his sleeve quite a bit, but they weren't just like right in your face. Like you could hear them, but he was morphing them into his own sound. Um, it, and I guess I don't really feel like any other bands at the time had really done that. It didn't take long for bands to latch on to that sound and kind of do their own version of it within a year or two. Like there were bands that were kind of riding that wave. But I do feel like they were kind of pioneering in that regard, taking their love of Pixies and Nirvana, um, and then obviously his like massive Kiss like obsession, which he sings about on the album, things like that were all present in that music, um, in a way that I didn't hear other bands doing. So that's a really long answer
No,
to
it's a great
the
answer. There's a lot
question,
there to
but
respond to.
it's it hit me, like a bus, and I was like right in the front of the bus. Like it didn't run me over. I just grabbed onto the
Yeah, you
bus.
strapped on. Yeah. Stayed on the bus
Long
for
time.
many. Yeah, yeah, yeah. In a sense, you're still on the bus, really. I
Yeah.
mean, and I want to talk about that. So you said a lot there. Um, it sounds like that was really the first thing that was yours, and like the first thing that was yours in a contemporary. I mean, you liked Guns N' Roses in the moment that they were, that Use Your Illusion was hitting, but like that was really um hit at a time where like your own tastes, um you could claim it completely as yours. Because didn't your brother have something to do with you getting into Guns N' Roses also?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I
Okay,
mean,
okay.
pretty much everything about the way I am as a musician came from my brother, Sam. Hey, Sam, if you catch this, awesome. Um, but yeah, you're right that Weezer was the first thing that I latched onto. Well, honestly, I'd say Green Day maybe even before Weezer because Dookie was '94 as well.
Right.
And everybody knows '94 was kind of a monumental year of music releases. I feel like Dookie hit me first, and I actually owned Dookie before I owned the Blue Album. Those songs were way more accessible for me as a guitar player than the Blue Album. And not it's not to say the Blue Album is a complicated music by any means, but it's slightly more complex
It's a little
than
more
Dookie.
angular in the way it's not quite as direct, I think, in the way it
Yeah, and
unfolds.
and the guitar playing on Dookie is really straight, punk, you know, just power chords, and there's really not much in terms of lead playing. And I was doing a lot of lead playing, but um, the Blue album came out, and then Rivers is, there's some shreddy moments on that album, so that connected me with me in a different way. But aside from saying Dookie is probably the first thing that hit me as my own, Weezer's the first thing that hit me and that I actually just kind of dove into and just fell completely in love with.
It's interesting also that you heard it out of order. I didn't know that. I should mention that the first time Steve and I met was in a recording studio that I worked at here in the city we live in. Shout out to Tony Gross, for whom I have so many things to thank. I mean, essentially the like way my life is now, I owe so much of that to Tony. But meeting good friends like Steve and his bandmates at the time, they were in a band named FM Green, and we can talk about that. I don't want to say too much about all that because I want to give you the floor to talk about the record. But I mean, I can remember the first time meeting you guys coming into the studio and with all your gear and unpacking it. And that would have been 2000,
I think it
the year
was,
two,
I think
January 2nd or something.
first EP we did, I think was January of 2001, maybe.
Okay, okay, okay. So I have the year. Okay, so that's 2001. Okay, that's right. That is right.
It was like
Um,
right after the new year. It was like right there.
Definitely. That was right after like vacation and everything and yeah, Christmas holidays. And I've been friends with all three of these guys ever since. But and I know Scott and his brother Steve was in a band named FM Green with two brothers, a singing drummer named Scott Cochler and his brother Rick on bass. And I wasn't aware that he turned you onto it. He must have had other stuff on the tape and taped over that. That's obviously what happened.
Yeah,
But why
yeah,
would the songs be out of order? That's I was like, how did that happen? And that would have been called a dub back then, not a rip
correct.
in
It was
'94.
it was it
Yeah, it
was dub.
was a cassette dub.
Technically, I guess it was a mix because he mixed up the order of the songs. But
Right. How like yeah. So how did that then change how you received the album itself? Because you were listening to this tape over and over and over.
um, I mean, what in what way? How did it change
Well, I mean,
when
when
I
you
heard the
finally heard the
CD?
correct order, how did that how did being used to this other order?
I don't think it really had much of an impact? I know that kind of stuff means a lot to you personally with playlists and sequencing and fade outs, and I know how obsessive you can get with that kind of stuff. And me too, for a, a large extent, but I don't have a memory of being other than being like, oh, that's wrong, or like this isn't the order that I'm familiar with. Other than that experience, um, it probably didn't last more than one playthrough where it was like, okay, this is how they meant for it to sound.
Okay, so you weren't so used to or attached to the order you heard.
No, no. And I wonder if Scott put him in the order of his preference. Like maybe he was like, this is like favorite to least favorite, or I don't know. That's something I should ask him, and he might not even remember why he did what he did. But and maybe I'm misremembering. I should dig up that tape.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember some cassettes on Mercury Polygram and even actually CBS as well. CBS Sony would have certain songs out of order. So like Rocks, Aerosmith Rocks, a bunch of
Yeah,
Kiss albums, a bunch of Rush albums would often have songs swapped or one tune or it's so I don't remember having like a big issue with that. Like you kind of readjust. But there are times when you hear one song going into another and expect the other song to come in, or maybe you've heard a greatest hits or something, and
yeah.
so, but it doesn't sound like that was an issue. When you say that where your personality was at the time, could you talk about what it was about the music that resonated with your personality?
Um, yeah. I mean, to be frank and honest, I would consider myself a nerd at that point in my life. I mean, I still am to some extent, but I was like, I didn't have a ton of friends freshman year of high school. I was playing trumpet and band and singing in choir and assisting with musicals and theater and like all this kind of stuff that you would consider with like a traditional band geek. Um, and then when I found the Blue Album and I started listening to the lyrics, I was like, oh, I feel like this guy is singing to me in a way that other bands weren't. Like I couldn't relate to the things that Axl Rose was singing about, but I could hear Rivers singing about, being a lonely dude, and I can hear him singing about, having a garage where he practices his guitar, like those kind of things like resonated with me in a way that other music hadn't at that point in my life. Um, so yeah, I mean, I just felt familiar with it from from the get go. Like I was like, it just the connection of being able to actually play those songs myself with being able to hear those lyrics and say, I relate to this. It connected with me in a way that almost nothing has ever done since or before, really.
Wow, so not even their second album, Pinkerton.
Pinkerton was a completely different experience. Um,
Or
I was
I suppose
reviewing,
I should ask, how do you, when you say that, because I know how much Pinkerton means to you, and we can get into that too. But
yeah.
um, if if almost nothing ever since, where does Pinkerton measure up to this sort of revelatory, life changing, experience you're having as at this super crucial developmental stage?
Similar but different. Like because Pinkerton is excuse me, is such a dramatically different album. Um, in
From
almost every way, from Blue.
right.
Um, it was a different kind of revelation. That by that point, it was less about me latching on to an artist, and that 2 years had passed. I had grown a bit. I was writing my own songs at that point in my life. And then Pinkerton came out, and I was like, okay, so a band can completely sound different from one album to the next. Like it's still Weezer, but it doesn't. they don't sound the same at all from a songwriting perspective, from a sonic perspective. Um, that's something I hadn't really considered. Um, I guess in hindsight, if I think about it more closely, like, yeah, Use Your Illusion sounds way different than Appetite for Destruction. But when I was 13 or 12, I didn't really notice. It just still
Right.
sounded like a bunch of, LA guys shredding in the studio. And um, but by 96, I was like, okay, the revelation was that there's nothing stopping a songwriter or a band from changing their style or um, changing the way a record is produced. They self-produced Pinkerton, so that made a huge difference. Obviously, like Rick Ocasek's fingerprints are all over the Blue Album in a positive way, not an overbearing kind of way. Um, so yeah, other than like the Blue Album and Pinkerton and how they connected with me, that nothing since those two I would say have really changed, other than maybe a David Bisson or Pedro the Lion album has one or two have kind of changed my life in more recent times, like this century. But um, yeah, those first two Weezer albums really hit me in a way that nothing's hit me since.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly you're not alone in this. I mean, the level, the outpouring of testimonials like yours to this record. I mean, it really
Yeah,
spoke to people and hit this chord in what I've come to see as a really beautiful way. And it took you guys, knowing you guys, to appreciate this, just knowing where the town you grew up in, like the suburban street. I
hmm
mean, when I wrote about the album Pacific Daydream, I said, the thing about Weezer was that you could have envisioned this coming from any cul-de-sac in any suburban lane anywhere in the country. I mean, that's Rick and Scott like grew up on a cul-de-sac, and I was literally picturing that. And I didn't appreciate that until it was personal for me through thinking about you guys. And then their music took on this sort of magical quality for me after that. But I mean, there's something about it that clearly struck a nerve and was like a voice of reassurance to so many kids. I mean, I've joked with you and I've teased Steve a lot and said, that's the album that made rock and roll safe for geeks, much to our detriment. But I mean, there's something really powerful and heartwarming about this, because there were millions of kids like you who all of a sudden felt like, oh, rock music can be mine too.
yeah, yeah. I think that's. I mean, I think that is it. Like, there were bands that were doing similar tones or like similarly smart music. Like, I'm a big They Might Be Giants fan, and obviously that album is maybe the nerdiest fan base you're ever going to find. And I don't say that begrudgingly. Like, they're incredible. Um, um, and I was a big fan of them as well at the time. I still am. But bands like Ben Folds Five were writing smart music that kind of sounded like could have been a musical. With rich harmonies and clever lyrics, and it wasn't. It was so like contrasty to the tone of grunge at the time, where everything was really dark and heavy, um, just drug laden and just sad and whiny, for lack of a better term. Um, Not really whiny. I don't mean to say whiny, but
Morose.
yeah, just
Yeah.
like the difference between Alice in Chains lyrics and Weezer lyrics couldn't be any broader. Like, that's the Grand Canyon of lyrical differences. Um, so yeah, I don't think you're wrong that Weezer kind of kicked open that door and said, "Listen, we have a place in this industry too. Here's our voice." In a way that other bands hadn't really been able to crack the code just yet. Like Ben Folds Five was popular, but they hadn't really like broken through until after. Um, Green Day was on a different kind of level. Like they were really more of a punk sensibility.
And they weren't dorky. They tried to look that way, I guess. But I
Yeah,
mean,
they
they
weren't.
they were not real. They were like pretend nerds, to be honest.
Yeah,
Put any of those dudes in your school, and the girls would have been like as high schoolers. You know what I mean? They would, and this is the thing. I'd never thought about this before. Prior to Weezer, dudes who played rock in high school were like the equivalent of jocks. They were not the same as jocks. Like it was like you had two avenues to coolness, right?
yeah,
But you either go one way or the other. And the nerds didn't have either of those options. I mean, I'm sure there's the occasional nerdy football player or nerdy guitar player prior to this, or I mean, look at the back cover of Cheap Tricks in Color. They tried to play up the fact that two of those dudes were super pretty boys, and two of those dudes were like, geeky looking guys.
yeah,
Like they tried to play up that contrast. I mean, look at Devo, right? But Devo to me were scary. Were like I actually thought like when I looked at Devo, I thought if these guys had not found music, they would have gotten into like terrorism or something horrible like that. Seriously, like
yeah,
they look like that to me. They're like frighteningly. There's something about them that like um I could see bad things for those guys if they hadn't channeled that into music, and they were very cutting and very angry too, even though it
yeah,
didn't sound that way. Weezer is like it just arrives at the perfect moment in your life, which I find so awesome, right? It's
yeah,
like this couldn't have been more of the universe speaking, sending you a direct fucking telegram from rock music. Like, okay, Steve, here you go. And for so many kids like you who felt this way, right? Who are like, well, I play guitar, but you know,
yeah,
you were not going
yeah.
to be Slash in your
Still not. Still
or
never
Eddie
going to
Van
be Slash.
Halen. But I mean that archetype. I mean that type of dude. You
Yeah.
that was not your um that was not on the table for you.
No, I mean, I went on to be a trumpet major in college and like get a music education degree, which is, not many people of my type um, could fall into that just sleazy, you know. Well, I guess sleazy might not be right, but
Or
the,
hedonistic.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just LA. That's just how I envision it. Like just walking down the Sunset Strip in 84 to 88, like just that's a type of personality that maybe doesn't exist anymore, but certainly was not something that I ever related to. Like, and I never envisioned that I could be that. Even when I was obsessing over playing along to Guns N' Roses songs, it was just because I thought they sounded good. It was never about the substance of the aesthetic. It was all about the substance of the music itself. Um, Whereas Weezer was about the substance of both of those things. Like I appreciated how they looked. I appreciated about what they were saying, and I appreciated how they sounded um, to a direction that no other band could have done at that time. Like I don't know. Maybe a couple years later, I could have connected with something else.
I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned Ben Folds 5. Ben Folds 5 had a very sort of they were nerdy, but they had a kind of cosmopolitan sophistication
Yes.
about them too. That it didn't quite speak to that. It's very like sort of urbane and yes, it's pop, and yeah, they're kind of also his sense of humor was like ironic enough. He was also making fun of um pop tropes, I think,
Hmm.
in a way that felt confident to me, like the way it came across. Not this vulnerable. I mean, you look at the cover of River, or you look at the cover of the Blue Album, and you see Rivers' picture, and I'm like, man, that is a vulnerable human being.
Yeah.
And I haven't looked at that cover too much. I'm like, man, he's just like super short. He just looks almost like a deer in headlights, like a very sensitive someone who would take things in and be frail. And I guess that's a cliche take on this record, or it's very convenient, but I mean, man, it's there, And the other thing, I had never given that album enough credit for how emotionally powerful it actually is. Because my first exposure was Sweater Song, and I was like disgusted by it, which is odd because I think that song is amazing now, years later. A really, really super powerful song, but I just did not. I could not get over my own projection and my like intolerance. I was like, well, these guys are just geeks and like fuck these guys and like I didn't I wasn't ready to to exist in a world where that wouldn't be held against somebody because I was held against me. I wasn't quite in the same situation as you, but I was definitely called a nerd where I grew up, and it's a lot of pressure, and it was at times physically endangering, right? It's like, people would remind me all the time and like get in my face. But it was also a little more complicated than that. Um, and I liked a lot of aggressive music too. So I
Yeah.
didn't quite when I saw the dudes on the cover of the Blue Album, I didn't say that's me. I just didn't like the fact that, well, why aren't they getting more shit? Why is the world allowing these people to, you know, and something about it just really bothered me. But I've had that response before. I remember having a similar response to Pavement, and I love Pavement now. So sometimes that initial flash of like fuck this, it's actually an affinity that you're not ready to accept yet. Um, but I now that I've sat with that first record, it's powerful. It is very dark actually in some ways. It's heavy without the sort of outward gloom of grunge.
Yes.
It's not an affectation, and I love a lot of grunge bands. I'm not saying that they were all putting on a show there, but there it's not outward, it's more internal.
Yeah. I agree with that. And that a lot has been said about some of the lyrical problems with the Blue Album, and especially Pinkerton, but problems in the just kind of misogynistic sort of way. Um, and not, I'm not giving it a pass, but he's also, Rivers has been very transparent about where all of that came from. When you think about the pairing of No One Else as song two, and then The World Has Turned and Left Me Here as song three, like No One Else is this guy being like, I want a girl who, when I'm gone, she's not thinking about anyone else, right? That's like the gist of that song, which is kind of a gross misogynistic way to live your life.
Well, but it's
And then
also it's also perfectly appropriate for an adolescent. I mean, he was basically not far from where you. I mean, he was older than you, obviously.
yeah, he probably wrote that when he was 27, 26, 27. Like he wasn't super young, but I wouldn't say young enough to give him a pass. But he was also self-aware enough to the next song of the album is him saying, "Fuck, I fucked up. Now I'm alone. The world has turned and left me here, and all I can do is spend hours looking at a photograph of you in my wallet. Like those kind of things. Like there is darkness on that album. Obviously, Say It Ain't So it is leached in darkness, where he's thinking about his memory of what he thought his dad being an alcoholic, which he turns out wasn't true, and stepdad. Um, like these things, I couldn't really relate to that. Like I came up from a pretty secure, standard household, but um, I can see how a lot of people listening to that album could hear those shades of darkness and be like, yeah, I hear what this guy is saying, and it's speaking to me personally. Um, Only in Dreams is a really sad song. It's an incredible way to end an album, but it's sad. Um, Buddy Holly is the only song on the album that's kind of just like a somewhat of a throwaway pop song. But even that one, if you, uh, I guess there's been just Rivers has described it that it's not actually about like literally looking like Buddy Holly. He's just talked about how it's um, more of like I'm trying to remember what the description was. It was about a platonic relationship he had with a female friend of his, um, and how he was more defensive of that person. I shouldn't even talk about it if I'm not totally
No, but
familiar
it
with
sounds like
the
there's
difference.
more layers. There's another layer to it than.
There's a depth to that song that's beyond just the surface level. Um, maybe Surf Wax is the only song on the album that's kind of just light. Um, and that that's very much an LA song, even though all these guys came from the East Coast and they all moved to LA and they met in LA. Um, but singing a song about surfing and stuff like that on an album is very much LA experience,
Well, and
Southern
their
California
homage
experience.
to the Beach Boys, isn't it? Or at least to that whole sort of vibe.
Yeah, and then the breakdown in the middle of that song with the essentially four-part harmony, which happens again in Holiday a couple tracks later. Um, to be honest, I don't even know if Rivers wrote it that way, and I would assume he did. Like he was very specific. His demos were very elaborate, but I don't know if Rick Ocasek had a finger on that as well, like saying it producing wise, being like, why don't you try doing this here? I would doubt he did. I've heard demos of Holiday, and that four-part harmony section is in there. So I think that's just something Rivers was into. And yeah, obviously he was influenced by the Beach Boys. Um, and that's how he chose to let that shine through. Um, but all of that to say that yes, lyrically there is a little bit of weight to it beyond what you might expect just from their outward appearance. Like the yes, Rivers looks a little bit odd on that cover, and you can, if you look close enough, you can see there's a little bit of um, just sadness in his face. But the cover itself is bright blue. It's like this is a bright album, and then the videos were all bright and funny.
Well, and their
Um,
demeanor while playing doesn't appear to be always. There's a brightness to their demeanor a lot, not always, but that was misleading. Like I did not get that Sweater Song was a emotional,
yeah,
heavy emotionally, just from watching the video.
yeah. I've come undone.
Yeah.
Pull this thread. As you walk away. Yeah, that's a kind of a it's not the happiest emotion, but then you're watching the video and they're like goofing off and there's dogs running around and it's like what is it, I think they kind of relished the sort of contrast between those things where it's there it was, yeah, it was hard to pin them down to a certain category of anything. Like there was lightness, there was darkness, there was humor, but there was sincerity in a heavy way. Um, and in live performances, I wouldn't say they were outwardly happy in their live performances until much later, like 2003, 2005. Like at that point in their career, they had changed dramatically in many ways, and Rivers had changed dramatically, and they were a much more happy band. But if you watch bootlegs from the mid '90s, other than Matt Sharp being just a complete madman, which was necessary on stage, like running around like crazy and drawing all this attention because Rivers literally stood there and didn't move, like kind of the definition of shoegaze, even though it's not what their music was. Um, Performance wise, it was not much to look at. I wouldn't necessarily call it happy. Um, so I don't know, even know what that says about the um, how that translates from the music itself. I think that was more of just a personality situation than how they felt performing that music.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
I mean, I do think they used humor as kind of an armor and
yeah,
goofiness.
yeah. By they, I would it, I think we need to be very careful about using the word they in terms when we're talking about especially those first two albums because it really was Rivers. Like almost every bit of both of those albums is strictly Rivers. You know, Pat Wilson, drummer, has co-writing credit on a couple songs in the Blue Album. Um, but everything on Pinkerton was straight from Rivers. Um, he had a pretty strict control over what those albums wound up sounding like and what songs were there. And, I can't really speak to what happened in pre-production and in the studio to decide what songs stayed or went. Pat himself, as you know, is a tremendous songwriter. He's got his own project. Matt has had an incredible career himself. I wouldn't incredible might be a bit much, but
Well, you
um,
in terms of artistically, where you would measure his artistic accomplishments.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the Rentals were a, a great band. They still are. Like they're still releasing music. So um, the fact that those first two albums came out and they were just Rivers' point of view primarily, um, uh, I feel like it's complicated or it's you shouldn't really use the word they when you're
Well, I mean,
describing them as a unit.
I do think to some degree Rivers hides behind a sort of goofy, somewhat like there's like there's an irony there with like the way he talks about heavy metal and shredding, but it's a sincere irony. It's not like pavement style irony where they're just like making fun of and sneering at something. Like he
Yeah,
really loves that stuff, but it's you could mistake them for being much more goofy than they actually were is I guess what because I know I did. I bought into the surface. Buddy Holly, some of the funnier underlying touches of the Sweater Song video, right? It's
mhm.
sort of like, oh, let's make this sort of absurd and goofy. Um, and I I do think that he has that exterior as a way of like a defense mechanism.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that, especially early in the career. He's grown to be a lot more outgoing and a lot more personable, and I don't know how he got to that point in his life because it's night and day different now than it used to be. Um, but there's outwardly speaking, even when I sat with you and you spoke to Rivers for, half an hour, he, that he was personable and
Very.
receptive to conversation, and it was a really easy conversation. But also, he like the timer went off. He's like, "Well, that's the time." He's like, "I'm out of here," and it was like very cold. And um, as opposed to when you spoke to Scott Schreiner, and I think he would have let you speak to him for 5 hours if you wanted to. Like
Well,
he
and
was
he hugged
just,
me. Didn't he hug? Didn't he give
yeah,
me a hug?
yeah, he
Yeah,
he
yeah.
did.
I have a post in the works, audio, talking about that story, telling that story about how we went. And I have a slightly different take on the whole that's our time than you do. I didn't take it as him being cold. I took it as, and I explained this in the audio segment. I think if I hadn't asked him to do that, he wouldn't have cut us off until somebody
Mm,
came. I think it was very, and I want to be careful about what I say here. I just think his makeup is more, well, oh, okay, these are the parameters. Okay, let's work within those parameters. And you said you wanted this time, so okay, now we're done. That's
got
how
it.
I took it. And I also, in that audio segment, talk about the timing was perfect anyway, because as you remember, right at that moment,
Yeah, we saw Pat
so 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 so
running.
so 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 Steve so Rivers' handler, his like personal assistant, comes in as Steve and I are packing up and says, I think Pat is on a boat, and their little trailer was like right along this like channel that goes out into the bay, or this bay like right on Lake Erie.
Yeah.
Um, so the handler, Rivers, Steve, and me all spill out of this trailer one by one, and we all just in time to see Pat Wilson on the back of a boat with a cigar in his mouth, and we all just like crane our heads, and he's smiling, and I was like, that is like that was so perfect, right? Like that happened in that moment. So it was, and I was so juiced by how well everything had gone. I didn't even care, even though, as you recall, I was wanting him to talk about what Pat brings to the band.
Yeah.
And, we didn't get to hear his answer about that, but that's okay. That's
Yeah.
okay.
I love that part of that memory because Pat is from Buffalo. So I, it, to see him in that moment, like enjoying himself that much in his hometown, I was just putting myself into his shoes and being like, this must be so cool for him. And he's toured the world. He's been everywhere by this point. This was 2013 or something. I don't even remember. It was
2014. It was
2014.
2014. It was before everything will be all right in the end was out.
Got
But I had heard the album, but it wasn't quite out yet.
Yeah. So, but they were massive stars at that point in their career. So, but just to see Pat being home, relaxed on the back of a boat, heading out into Lake Erie, that made me feel really good for him. I really love Pat. I think what he brings to the music is, um, I don't know, I couldn't even define it. I think Weezer would be an immensely different band without Pat Wilson involved. Um, as a drummer for sure, though to a lesser extent, in more recent albums, as they've gone in a more pop direction and some of the drums have been programmed and things like that. That's one thing, but what Pat brought to the early years of Weezer is undeniable. Um, I was saying that those albums, Pinkerton and Blue, are all Rivers' songwriting, except for a few little bits on Blue that Pat contributed to. Um, but Rivers wasn't writing those drum parts. And when you hear the drumming on both of those albums, and Pinkerton in particular, Um, uh, I'm not sure another drum style would have worked. And that's easy to say. I mean, who really knows what that
No, but he
music?
fits hand in glove with, and there's something symbiotic about, like, he is like the perfect drummer for that situation, and I can't quite put my finger on why that is, but it's like as the band as an organism like needs him.
Yep, yeah, and as he's kind of been reduced as a contributing member of their sound, which I don't know, that's a kind of a weird sentence, but like the last time I felt Pat Wilson being Pat Wilson was on Maladroit, which was 22 years ago, right? I mean, that was a 2002 album. Um, and, the whole band was just really letting their shred fly on that album in a way that never happened before and hasn't happened since. Um, but that's the last time I really feel like Pat was able to showcase himself as a drummer. He's, there's moments in the album since where you're like, oh, that's a hell of a fill, or like that beat is incredible. But that album, his drumming on Maladroit is spectacular. Um, and Maladroit as an album, we can talk about this at some point, but that I feel like that's their most underrated album by far. Like it's highly overlooked because Green was so popular in 2001, and then Maladroit came immediately a year later. They came out with Maladroit, um, and I'm intimately familiar with the production of that album, but it came so quickly. I just don't think people were ready for it, and it sounded so different from everything else that was popular at that time. I just didn't. People didn't take it in the way I feel like it deserved to be heard.
Do you know what its sales figures are?
It's probably gold. Like at this point, I'd be surprised if it had gone platinum after this long. I don't think it has.
So when you say that album wasn't, people weren't ready for Maladroit, and we'll get back to the Blue Album and everything you touched on, but what do you mean? Like, what was the reception like as you saw it?
Uh, I feel like they were just overwhelmed. Um, you know, in the 70s and 80s, as you know, bands were putting out an album a year, right? It was just,
Often two.
yeah, right. But there wasn't as much volume of music. Like there weren't a, you couldn't pull up Spotify and listen to a billion different bands. Like you were just getting what the studios were giving you for the most part. Like, that's not for the most part. I feel like that is what just the paradigm was at that time. You were just
Definitely.
getting what they were releasing. Um, so fans could take in two albums a year from Aerosmith or from Kiss or whoever. Like it was just they had the capacity to take in that kind of music. By 2002, when Maladroit came out, there was so much music being released, and it's even more now that when Weezer releases the Green Album in May of 2001, I think it was exactly the same day. I think it was May 10th, which is interesting. But and they were popular. Like "Island in the Sun" was a huge song, and "Hash Pipe" was popular, and but I feel like those songs were still on the charts a year later, and then Weezer releases Maladroit, and I just don't think the population in general was ready to be like, oh crap, there's new music from Weezer. Um, I feel like it got overlooked, and then the singles weren't like super awesome. Like they weren't the best singles Weezer's released. So a combination of just fans just being overwhelmed with the amount of music that's being released. Not necessarily fans specifically, but just the general population of music fans. And then the music just not hitting them quite the way that maybe the previous albums had. Um, that's what I mean. People just weren't ready for it. Like it just, they didn't have the capacity to add more Weezer into their diet, their musical diet, because they were still trying to absorb the music or digest the music they had just gotten a year before. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it was released in the comet tail of the commercial success
yes, that's a
of
great way to put it.
the Green album, and it's also not nearly, it just isn't as commercial, like overtly commercial as the Green
No,
album is. So it's more of a
not at all.
challenging listen. And I hate those songs, Hash Pipe and Island of the Sun. I like just like they. It's just like I look at it as like neon green goop, like just just horrible poison. You know, not the band Poison, but just this neon glowing just blob of yucky,
Yeah,
overly sweetened commercial dreck. But yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't know
no,
when it changed. Like when it went from two albums a year, or at least one album a year, to in the 90s, bands were waiting 2 years between releases. And now it's sometimes 4 or 5 years between releases.
right, if not more than that. Yeah, it's interesting because you and I met when recording gear was becoming more affordable to the
Mhm.
average person, and yet albums were taking longer and longer and longer and longer. It's counterintuitive. And, obviously there's a music industry behind that, and they're sort of stretching albums for longer. They're getting more more bang for their buck out
Yeah.
of a single record, and bands on a touring cycle of like 2 years and everything. But yeah, it's interesting. There's an FM Green sticker on the guitar that Rivers is holding on the Green album, and I've always meant to ask you what your response to that was. And I mean, because I mean that must have been such a huge thing for you. And like, who noticed it, and what was your feeling when you did?
Yeah. So the story there is, before Green Album was released, the Weezer did they played the Warp Tour in 2000, and they were shocked at the reception because they didn't think that they were as popular as fans were,
Right,
considering them.
as any Weezer fan knows, or even a casual observer, Pinkerton was considered a bomb. It only went gold in comparison to the first album selling 5 million or whatever it did in the States, being a huge hit. And obviously you know all this. Then Rivers goes to Harvard and feels very dejected about all this, and is really ambivalent about whether he's going to continue the band. And then slowly but surely they start working on other stuff. And you saw them in the
Yes,
run up to the Green album, and you
you
had a
got it.
very different impression based on what you saw live that album was going to sound like.
Correct. Yeah, so the Warp Tour happened, and that was like, oh shit, people still care about us. And then they booked their own headlining tour um, to play that summer and fall, and um, that tour had a stop in Buffalo, and I had been friendly and communicating with Carl Cook, who is like essentially their webmaster, but he's often referred to as the fifth member of Weezer. Like he's been their best friend from 91 or whatever since they all met. Um, and kind of an integral piece of the Weezer puzzle. Um, so through being somewhat friendly and familiar with Carl, and then through WBER, the local station here in Rochester, I was able to set up an interview um, for the station with Weezer in Buffalo before the show. So I assisted, Joey, who was hadn't yet taken over running the station, but he was a main part of the station at BER. And I assisted him with the interview, which happened on their tour bus. And it was Mikey Welsh, the bass player at the time, and Pat Wilson. Um, so, the interview happened, and being an obsessive fan, I knew that Rivers during that tour, and this is like early internet, right? Not early internet, but this is before modern internet. This
Well,
the
this
year
is before
2000.
bands are on. This is before bands are on the internet. The internet's had been around,
Yes,
email, but before music
before
communities
social
start to
media.
form. Yeah, yeah, around.
Yep. So, but just there were, message boards and email lists, and these are
Right,
things that
the
I was
early
like,
days of that. That started in
I
like the mid
was,
'90s, and then yeah,
yep,
yeah, yeah.
yep, and I was obsessively involved in all of those communities, and so through that, I realized that Rivers was like collecting stickers and stuff, and just putting them on his guitar before shows. Um, and he would take any fan sticker and just stick it on his guitar. So knowing that, I went to the show with some stickers of my band, FMGREEN, in my pocket, and I, carried them onto the bus during the interview. And then when the interview was done, I was like, "Hey, Carl, here's the sticker. Can you get it to Rivers?" And he did one better. Carl, I watched him take the sticker and, walk from the bus, which was immediately behind the stage, around to the side of the stage, up the stairs, and straight up to the Rivers guitar, which was already set up on stage, and just stuck it right in the middle, like between the Rivers two humbuckers on his Strat, like boom, right in the middle. I was like, oh, that's awesome, right? I was like thrilled. I was so happy. As you can
Because that
imagine,
alone is such a triumph.
yeah, that was
That was enough right there.
that was
Right,
enough. Even if it
right.
had been covered up the next day, at least for that show in Buffalo, like Rivers was up there playing a guitar with our sticker in the middle of it. And that, it was mixed among a whole bunch of other stickers, but it was front and center. And that show was great. It was, that was the first time I had seen them since '96. It had been a long time. It was hot. I remember it was outdoors, like behind a venue that was called Runways. Um, and it was like they had like a sand beach volleyball court in the backyard. So like the fans were standing in sand, which was kind of a unique experience. It was like almost like being at the beach, but we weren't at the beach. But it was super hot, middle of summer. Anyway, so that night was great. I got the sticker on there, and I had kind of just forgotten about it. Like I went on with the rest of my life. I was like, that's awesome. And then the album came out, and during the promo and lead up to the album being released, the album cover was shown online, and I was like, oh, guitar looks familiar, but the pictures weren't really high resolution enough at that point in the internet to be able to like, is that the guitar right there? Is that my sticker? So I didn't really know until the album was released. So a local record store called Record Archive used to have a location on Mount Hope Avenue, and they hosted a release party that night at midnight. And I was like asked to be the MC, which is like not in my personality to be an MC, like get on the mic and try and hype people up. So I was just there. Like to call myself an MC is way exaggerating things, but I was there. I was invited and asked to be there for the event. Um, but part of that meant I got to be there early, and I got to see like posters on the wall. And it was when I walked in and I saw like I don't know, like a big, giant poster sized album cover that I was like, holy fucking shit. Like that's the guitar. And then I looked closer, I was like, that's my sticker. That's the band right there. So I was the first person to notice it in the band because I was the first person to actually see it large enough. And then I got the CD in my hand, and I got the a vinyl in my hand. I was like, you can see it on the CD. It's there. And now this doesn't really mean anything to anybody other than me, Scott, and Rick, right? Because
And
it's not
me.
like, and you were a big part of our story, but it's not like we made a splash outside of our friends and family and a few local fans. We never really cracked anything. We should have, but we didn't. Um, but for us, it was, life changing. It's like, holy shit, like our favorite band, their breakthrough new album that everybody was psyched about. If you look close enough, you can see our sticker on the cover of that album. That, I know, it filled my battery for a long time, like just running off the excitement of that. And I still talk about it, which is weird. Like I hate like being nostalgic about that kind of thing and trying to talk about it. But if people bring up the Green album, I'm like, hey, my sticker's on that album because it's interesting. It's kind of cool.
It's
Um,
extremely cool. It's just an acknowledgement from, I mean, just that, like you said, this was still like the earliest days of bands having a lot of interaction with fans, and Weezer were one of the first. But well, I don't know if they were one of the first, but they are starting to get on that wave right around this time.
yeah,
And just for that, for like in like a quantum physics kind of way, like for to when you think of your favorite bands and like the space in reality they occupy, and for that to overlap with yours like that on their album cover, it's super cool.
yeah, it's a great memory. Um, it's still a great surprise. Yeah, I don't know. I should probably buy a poster size copy of that album cover just because it's fun and it's a good conversation starter. Um,
Now, your reaction to that album itself, though,
yeah,
was less enthusiastic.
yeah. I mean, I don't think it's as I wasn't as offended as you seem to be with Green Slime, but um, I took it home that night and I listened to it probably 5 times on repeat. It's a really short album, and I loved it, and I still think it's good. I don't think it's a bad album, but it was immediately apparent that it was a stark overreaction to the reception of Pinkerton. Like Rivers seemed incapable of ignoring the critics and releasing more music that was true to what he, I don't know if that's the right description. Um, it, Pinkerton was so raw emotionally, so vulnerable lyrically, um, and everybody knows that the because it was so poorly received that he took that super personally and he felt like a failure. Um, and instead of doubling down and just being like, no, fuck it, this is the music I want to make, he went the other direction. And the songs in the Green album are so formulaic and super just glossy and pop. They brought Rick Ocasek back, who did great work, but they're almost lifeless. Some of those songs, where you listen to them and you're like, okay, verse, chorus, done. Or verse, chorus, solo, but the solo is literally just the melody of the chorus or of the verse, and then another chorus and you're done. So there wasn't much depth to the music, and there wasn't, I would say, any depth to a lot of the lyrics. Um, and some of them were just completely not seemingly nonsensical. Like he wasn't opening himself up at all, as opposed to what he had done previously on both the first two albums were very vulnerable records. Green was not that at all. So it aside from just being a super fan and being open and happy to receive any new music, it I burned out on it pretty quickly, and I still haven't burned out on Pinkerton or Blue. I could listen to those albums at any time and be perfectly happy to be spending my time doing that. If you asked me to listen to the Green album, I'd be like, okay, like sure, I will, but I'm probably not going to enjoy it. Um, but like fucking stickers on the cover, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, I received it very differently than I had the previous two. And I was, by that point, I was May of 2001. I was 21. So, I was in a different spot in my life. Had just graduated from college. Um, I wouldn't say I was listening to very much different music. It was still a lot of the same bands that I had been a fan of when I was in high school. But um, the Green album just sounded so sterile in a way that it just didn't connect with me. And as opposed to a band like Super Drag, who was also one of my favorite bands, who debuted in '96. So same time frame. I was 16, and then in '98 they had another album. Still, I was 18. Hit Me Great, and then in 2000 they released an album um, that is one of my top five albums of all time. Um, and that one connected with me just fine. So I don't know if it's. I have to say that the difference is the music itself that is on the Green album. It's not so much me being a different person as much as it is just them releasing a bit of a dud of an album um, comparatively to what they had done. Um, and it took them quite a while to give me something new that didn't make me feel like it was empty. They got there. It took a while, but they got there. Um, but yeah, so I was pretty disappointed with the Green album. It still inspired me to make music, and right, so that came out in May of 2001, and then I was in the studio with you in the band in September of 2001 recording our debut album. So um, like when we met, it was the prevalent Weezer album of the time. Like it was all over the airwaves. It was kind of impossible to not be around it. So that's how I received it. I mean, it didn't hit me the way that the first two had,
Well, and
which was,
especially after a 5 year buildup, and also seeing some of the songs live that didn't make the record that you liked more than the ones that did, and enjoying the band and the new energy in the band at the time. And then they turn out this thing that is really a renunciation of everything, like his artistic expression, his personal, like using the music as like a personal a canvas to express his feelings. Like as you say, he completely shut that down, and you can tell.
and it needs to be said that, Matt Wilson or not, Matt Sharp had left the band in '97 um, to focus on the rentals full time. And him not being a part of Weezer, uh, I think it's dramatically a different band without Matt Sharp. Um, no, I mean, a lot has been said about the, that specifically, but that, Scott Schreiner now has been in the band for 25 years or whatever. So he's far and away the longest tenured bass player of Weezer. Um, but he's not Matt. Like the energy that Matt brought to his first two albums is undeniable, and it's missing on the Green album. And I don't even know if he was still in the band if Rivers would have been accepting or allowing that energy to continue to shine through, or if Rivers still would have tamped that down the same way he tamped down everything else.
Well, I mean, Matt Sharp was a counterbalancing force. To whatever degree
Yeah.
he was limited as a contributor or songwriter, there definitely was, and bands need this, there definitely was a push and pull. Like he challenged, just even his presence seemed to challenge Rivers. And I think every
Mhm.
band leader needs that. And band leaders tend to shun that and create the conditions to cut that off.
Yeah.
And eventually the person leaves, and then they bring somebody in who's much more willing to go along and accommodate their need for control. Whereas I think for a band to be healthy, you really do need pushback. Even just on, like I said, an energetic level, somebody who is not undermining your authority, but not just blindly accepting it either. Yeah, I mean that album to me is really unfortunate, but I'm surprised to hear you say they didn't. I forgot the exact wording, but you said that it didn't feel empty until much later because I thought that Maladroit was did not have that empty quality.
Not musically. Lyrically, it was a little bit more real. Um, Musically, it's incredible. Like that was like the combination of the the shred that I loved so much with it was Rivers like letting his metal roots shine through, and then Scott Schreiner coming in as a bass player who himself is a just incredible bass player. Um, all four of them. Brian, I haven't mentioned at all today, but Brian's contributions and Pat's performances on those on Maladroit are just it is musically. I think it's the only Weezer album that I can't really jam along to. And for that reason alone, I think it's like something that I really find impressive. Like it's this band that's kind of known for power pop and pop rock and this kind of just kind of easily accessible musical ability to, and they're coming out and they're just shredding all over that album. And for that reason, I love it. Um, there's a few songs that have a little bit of interesting and realness in the lyrics. Take Control comes to mind. Um, there's songs that we'll talk about like that are directly referencing the fan input that went into the production of that album. Um, Space Rock, I think, is the song that has lyrics that are calling out fans essentially. Um, but I don't think the full picture came back for me as a Weezer album until Everything Will Be All Right in the End, which was 2014, which was so that's another 12 years past Maladroit. There's stuff in between where I'm like, oh, that there's little moments that are great. Like the Red album, people hate the Red album. It was 2008.
I love it.
I I love it. I think it's weird and super interesting. But there's songs in there that I think are spectacular, super great songs, where there's lyrical depth, there's musical stuff that's interesting and not just sterile. Um, but yeah, it wasn't until 2014 that I felt like they put the whole thing back together. And ironically, Everything Will Be All Right in the End was another Rick Ocasek album. Um, but Maladroit was self-produced, so they kind of had this cycle. Like Blue Album was Rick, and it sounded this way. Pinkerton was self-produced and it sounded vastly different. Green Album was Rick and it sounded this way. Maladroit came out, it was self-produced and it sounded vastly different. Um, Next album was Make Believe, and that was a Rick Rubin album. So you're going to get the Rick Rubin style out of that, and it sounds to me like Rick Rubin. Like it's got, I don't connect with that album very much, but there's some singles on that album that I think are super cool. The Perfect Situation is a great song, incredible hook, really cool lyrics. But then there's other songs that on that album where I'm just like, really? But that's how it goes for me now with Weezer. I'll take the good. If I get good, I'm going to take it. I'm going to love it, and I can just let the bad go and not be offended by it. Um, there are Weezer diehard fans who are just Weezer died in '96 after Pinkerton, and everything since has been trash. I'm like, that's a really kind of not fair way to analyze a band like that. Like they've changed, but that doesn't mean it's all been crap. It's just a different band.
Well, see, I have mixed feelings here because on the one hand, I do think, and I've pointed this out for years, this is a case of someone who, for whatever reason, did not have the inclination to double down and say, well, you rejected, and actually it didn't, eventually it was not rejected. It was like anti-rejected, right? But like you didn't receive my most personal work. So now I'm going to withhold because I don't feel comfortable or whatever it is, I don't feel comfortable going there, or I'm not going to go there. Maybe he did feel comfortable, just chose not to. Um, and I think that's really, it took him a long time to come back from that, for that resistance to thaw. And I agree with you on everything will be all right in the end. You see this like incredible blend of all these different things they've touched on. And I thought that was really impressive that he came back to it, but I think he took way too long
Mhm.
to really reject his own expression, to reject his own muse and not be natural about following it. What I've become more sympathetic to over time is that, look, especially someone like him, we talked about the isolation that defines that first album, this feeling of I'm alone and I'm making music because I have to, right? I have to express this. All of a sudden that strikes a chord with 5 million people or more than that all over the world. And that is an incredibly destabilizing experience, even under the best of circumstances. I think for someone like him, very, very introverted, you know, I don't know whether we should or shouldn't say this here, but appears to have spectrum traits for anybody that has an eye for recognizing that. Like very, very socially awkward. He didn't take that well. The success part, well,
Yeah.
not to mention then the rejection afterwards. And when if you go gold the first time and then you sell 5 million the second time, that's an upward climb. If you sell 5 million right out of the gate and then go down to a tenth of that, then there's no way that's not going to feel like a letdown or a failure. I also think he has always measured success in terms of how the music is received on a mass scale, which I think is a tremendous mistake for artists to always be looking for that kind of validation, because sometimes they don't align. Sometimes your most true expression, what you feel is I mean, how many bands, if you and I sat down like our favorite bands, how many of our favorite songs are the hits? There are some really overplayed songs on I don't get sick of ever, but the majority of them I feel are not representative of Like there's like 25 Led Zeppelin songs I'd pick before Stairway to Heaven, and on and on and on and on and on down the list. And so I don't know what it is about him that he always was seeking. Maybe it's the fact that he did it the first time. Maybe he's like, "Oh, I write songs and they become hits," right? Maybe he was expecting it to happen every time. Maybe that spoiled him. But I feel like his whole outlook on music, even the songs they picked to cover on that Teal record, ay, ay, ay. Teal is my daughter's favorite color, and fuck those guys for intrude for uh but like it's just a jukebox. It's like a diner jukebox of songs.
Yeah. That's-
Yeah, the Teal album makes me cry too, if I had to sit through that. But I mean, it's almost like the success and the rejection sent the band into a tailspin. And yet, this is the other side of it. What I really fucking admire about those guys, or about him in particular, he alternates between these two gears. He still, I mean, he could have completely just made Green album type commercial schlock forever, right? He could have stayed in that rut and probably would have paid off. I mean, it has paid off. He has done other records like that, and you don't like the song Beverly Hills. I do, but like that's an example of that kind of thing, right? Um, but yet several of their records since have been more artistic. And so I have to tip my hat to him for like playing both sides of the fence.
yeah, I don't disagree with that. Um, yeah, that's it. I don't disagree with that. I do feel like I don't know if the, sorry, it's getting a little too dark now. I don't know if how much of that is an internal, um, like self-analysis, or how much of it's coming from some sort of external source. Um, no, I guess it's got to be him. I think you're right. It's got to be him.
His own
The
inner
other,
critic, maybe.
yeah, the other members don't, as far as I can tell, don't have much of a voice in the direction of the band itself. Um, and they've bounced around to different labels since their Geffen contract ran out. So I don't feel like there's anybody from a label standpoint that's trying to be like, hey, this album wasn't so great. You need to, can you pump out some hits? I don't feel like it's coming from there. So I think you're right that that his ability to still write hit songs, but um, still put out interesting albums at the same time, sometimes literally together on the same album. Um, yeah, that's an admirable thing for somebody who went through what he went through with Pinkerton's failure, perceptive failure. Uh, yeah, even like the OK Human, the acoustic orchestral album they released, um, which was like right at the height of COVID, right where that came out. Right, it was 2019 or 2020. I think it was 2020. But that song, that album was really kind of brave and daring to put out an album that sounds that way as Weezer. It's not like Metallica going out and recording with an orchestra, and that's kind of like a gimmicky kind of thing to do. But this was like Rivers being like, I'm going to write the songs I would typically write with a rock band, but we're going to arrange it for this acoustic orchestral kind of performance, and it worked great. and one of the songs on that album was a huge hit. So he can do both. But then he can put out an album like the Black Album, which is, I listened to it once and I haven't listened to it again since. Or like Pacific Daydream, I didn't love pretty much anything on that album. I think my favorite song on Pacific Daydream, I can't even tell you what the title was, but I preferred the demo version, which was written 20 years earlier for Make Believe, like when they released a whole bunch of demos for Make Believe. Um, that's kind of how it goes with Rivers, but you're not wrong that it, it's he does this kind of push and pull, this flip and flop cycle of the type of albums he's writing, and yeah, it's unique. I don't think many bands work in a similar style. I don't
Hmm.
know if I could identify any band
Right.
that does.
Certainly not with in reaction to what the fans have expressed, which I used to really hold that against him, as you know, from years of me harping on and on and on about how lame that is. And but actually, again, I've got a different perspective on that now. But just going back a second, well, this is very related or tied in. I can also see why he equates his artistic accomplishment with commercial, like tapping into what the masses respond to, because he's so fucking good at it. He's like natural at it. That's one of the things I've really come to appreciate over time. I mean, this guy can write a fucking hook. And that's also one of the things that I found so like dismaying about that whole Black Room period, and how he, again, the Weezer fans will know all about this. You're the first person to tell me about this, and I'm like, oh my God, that's fucked up. It's like really alarming actually that someone would lock themselves in a black room, and how scientific he got about writing songs and reducing it to this formula and becoming really obsessive about that. To me, though, I look at that a little more sympathetic. Like, I'm like, he's the last person that has to worry about that, right? I mean, wouldn't you say? Like he doesn't need to rely on those formulaic um types of mechan devices, because it's innate to him anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, in the past 10 to 15 years, a lot of the music on their releases has, much like all the other pop music that's being released today, you look at the credits list and there's 3 to 5 songwriters on a hit single.
Mhm.
So how much of it is actually Rivers right now, and how much of it is, people lending their ear, like a Jackknife Lee or Jake Sinclair, like these guys who he's worked with, who themselves are hyper talented songwriters,
And hit makers
coming
in
hit
particular, yes.
makers.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, coming in and planting a seed, or being like, "That's a great idea. Why don't you do this with the melody?" Or I like those lyrics. Why don't you do this? And to this day, Rivers is even talking about how he's got spreadsheets with lyrics, like just lyrical ideas, but he's got them breaking down by like number of syllables and theme. And if he's like writing a song and he knows he needs like 6 syllables, he'll pull up a spreadsheet and look for any set of words that has 6 syllables in it, and try and like pigeonhole it into the song, whether or not the words themselves actually apply to the music. Um,
Okay,
so
so
those kind of
that's
things, it's really still kind of mathematical.
yes. And again, that goes to his OCD, potentially spectrum type behavior. But the way I interpret that is twofold. One, I think that the Black Room period was a profound, severe, and rather serious episode of self-doubt and other mental health
Yep.
issues going on. and the response to fame and that whole cycle, right? Of intense validation, and then everything else that that comes with, and then the rejection. But also, that's his way of honing his craft. There are elements that like any other songwriter would tune into some of those really laser, like they drill down on some of those specifics. I don't think it takes away from how just naturally gifted he is. I think he thinks he needs to do that stuff. And I think he's slightly mistaken about that. And he would argue, well, I know because I'm the one doing it. And I know that, a song like Troublemaker, maybe I went to my spreadsheets, but it does not feel that way. I think usually when you make music with that's that meticulous, it feels that way. It feels like it was arose out of that kind of anal retentive focus. Those first couple records do not feel that way to me. There is a formula, obviously, there is a thing that he has, there's a sort of a recipe that he brings. So he doesn't need to do that. And if Troublemaker is that, if that's what it is, then all the more power to him, I guess. But I always kind of cringe when he talks about songwriting in that scientific, like let's break this down to the atomic structure kind of a way,
Yeah.
because it's as if he feels he has to do that, and I think he's one of the people that doesn't. I think he could just show up in a room, like if like he taught a songwriting course, like one of those online, like I bet you
Masterclass.
what's that?
Masterclass.
Yes, yes, he should actually. That'd be really fucking cool, and all the geeks would come in droves. They'd come over the hills like fucking Braveheart or something to take that course. But I think he would focus on those things when it would take somebody else, another songwriter who's more sort of gut based, to be like, oh no, actually, dude, this is what you're doing, and this is why it sounds so natural. Because I mean that, dude, I love the Red album. I love how daring it is. I love how fucking weird and out there it is. I mean, that takes guts, man, to put out a record like that. But you can afford to when you've pleased the masses, right? But that song Troublemaker, I'm like, this guy just has this thing. Like that song is a fucking earworm and it gets in your head and it's just like it does not leave.
Hmm.
You know? And I just wonder how much labor, how belabored it was to create that.
Two chords. Like that's a two chord song for the most part. Like I think there's maybe a third chord in a little bridge section, but it's two chords. So um yeah, I he has an innate ability to write a hook. Um and he always has. It's always been there. You can tell when you listen to the guitar break in Buddy Holly, right? Which is iconic. Like that's iconic. You play that 2 seconds of music for anybody and they know exactly what it is. And he wrote that before the album, he wrote that in 92 or whatever. Like you hear it on the demo, it's there. So you're not, I agree that he has just an innate ability to be a great songwriter and that it can, you could say it's a little offensive when he just doesn't trust his instincts and he relies on formula and over analysis to try and get where he needs to get. Can I tell you how he writes a song like Troublemaker? No, at this point in my life, I don't know how he does such a thing. But even beyond that, like that was 2008. That's almost 20 years ago. He's writing that, and then still he's still able to write music that um, connects with a mass appeal this late in his career, 30 years into his career. That's that's impressive. Like I don't know many. I, I don't know many bands that are still doing that. Honestly, I'm trying to think about like maybe Foo Fighters are still able to this late in their career. Dave Grohl is writing songs that connect with people, but I don't think they are mass appeal. Like they're connecting with Foo Fighters fans. You know,
Right.
Pearl
Not
Jam
even
is
Pearl
still a
Jam is
band.
doing it. Not,
Yeah, but they're not in like the radio isn't playing Pearl Jam songs. Modern rock
right.
radio isn't playing new Pearl Jam. But if Weezer puts out an album tomorrow, it almost certainly they're going to be playing whatever the latest Weezer single is on a modern rock station and probably also on a pop station. Like you could put a lot of what Rivers is writing alongside a Taylor Swift song, and it wouldn't sound out of place.
What about
Um,
virally too? What about how much are they? I know Africa, but that's a slightly different thing. But um, how do those songs do in terms of catching on with people online?
that I don't know. That brings up a weird thing. Is that so? I work in a school, and I am around young people all the time. Um, even like not like students, but like I work with people who are like 25, 26-year-old adults that I'm working with them. And like at the lunch table a couple weeks ago, I mentioned that Weezer was my favorite band of all time. And this woman I worked with was shocked. She's like, Weezer, like that's so weird. Like it never would occur to her that anybody would be that big of a fan of that band. So she's what, 26, Gen Z, I guess, or late millennial. But I don't know if Weezer is connecting with a younger audience um,
Or
from a
even
viral standpoint. Like I don't know if like they almost seem like a joke to me. Like some people like write them off as a joke now, 30 years into the career, um, where people might be making fun of songs like Buddy Holly and things like that from
well, I
that
don't know
time
about
period.
that. I don't know about that. I'm like just from the way what I've seen on TikTok and YouTube, younger people do latch on to classic titles by legacy artists. What I'm curious about is like, Weezer's White Album, when they put out the single on YouTube, how many millions of, if like, if that would crack like millions of hits.
Yeah,
Um, because, obviously the classic songs and videos have been racked up like, and I'm about to go on their Spotify. I bet you Voyage to the Blue Planet tour with the Flaming Lips. Okay. Um,
and Dinosaur Jr. That's a fun tour.
yeah. Okay, so Dark Enough to See the Stars, 268,000 views. That's not, I mean, that's great. But Weezer, I Want a Dog, 319,000 views. Basketball, 88K views.
Those are
This,
all like from the seasons stuff that they
right,
released.
right. Hero official video from 4 years ago of 2.9 million views. So that's the end of the game official video 4 years ago, 5.3 million views.
Yep.
So all my favorite songs, official video 3 years ago, 3.6 million views. So they're still Can't Knock the Hustle, 3.8 million views. High as a Kite, 3.6 million views. I'm taking it you're familiar with all these songs. I'm not. Zombie
Hmm.
Bastards, 1.2 million views. So not
Not great.
well, not terrible. Definitely like more than respectable. I would say that's not bad.
Yeah, but I guess you need to put it in perspective though. What's a comparative band, legacy band releasing new music?
Well, I think for right, I think for where they've been and the fact that they're still hitting on terrestrial radio
Yeah,
or commercial rock radio, um, I think that that's um that's still really to be doing those numbers on YouTube. I think I think there's something really impressive about that. And as much as I have always thought the commercial radio is total garbage. It's just like generic. It hurts to even fucking like that sound to me. That stuff sounds like digital toothpaste, like just being pumped out of speakers. Like it's got this like sheen to it, like this like very specific. But if dude is still doing work on there, putting work out that strikes a chord with that, then there's something there. Especially like you said, in an orchestral arrangement that says his songs have something. And I don't think they're being ignored online either. Of course, though, everybody wants to rule the world. Their cover of that, 3.9 million views. Like I think everything on the Teal album has racked up millions of views. So they're not hurting for attention. And they
yeah.
do have go ahead, sorry.
Africa, like that cover launched them to another tier that they hadn't really ever seen before. I think that was their first number one single ever was their cover of Africa, which came 25 years into their career, and it wasn't even their own song.
And it
It was
was just a one-off. It was like kind of a lark thing they did on request, right? Isn't that didn't somebody
people,
request?
yeah. So the lore behind that is some young fans, young, like literally young fans, like 12-year-old fans, were like goading them into covering Africa. They're like, we should cover Africa. Like it became this kind of movement online. So from that perspective, you're right that they do have some sort of viral life. Um, as a joke, Weezer released their cover of Rosanna, right,
Right.
first, and which was hilarious and a pretty good cover, to be
Yes,
honest.
I thought it was very I thought it was very well done.
Yeah, and both of them are very true to the original, but I prefer listening to Rosanna. I think it's a really well done cover.
I thought they were done with I thought they dignified the original songs very nicely.
Yeah, yeah, it was, and they were done with respect and not
Right.
in a pure jokingly. We're just gonna.
Mm-hmm. Very respectful, very tasteful.
Um, and then a couple of weeks later, they dropped Africa, which they had obviously done in the same session. Like it was clearly the plan all along. But yeah, that Africa cover is what I do wonder if they hadn't done that, either of those covers, but specifically if they hadn't actually done an Africa cover, if their career, if they would be completely invisible and transparent to, TikTok generation and people who are into that social media hardcore lifestyle where they're spending all their time staring at a phone. Africa became their tunnel into that world. And I don't know
Mm.
if they had that tunnel without that single.
Hmm. Yeah, it's hard to say. So I'm going to look up their Spotify. What would you guess their top five songs are? So what would you guess?
Saving, so I would guess Beverly Hills, um, all my favorite songs. I would guess probably something off Gratitude. If you're wondering if I want you to, I would guess Island in the Sun.
So it's five.
Uh,
I mean, I can only see the five.
yeah,
So Do you want to hear them?
Yeah.
Number one at 751, 562, 800, what's it? 751 million, five hundred
Got it.
sixty-two thousand 852 streams, Island in the Sun. At number two, predictably enough, at 485,344,789.
Oh, Africa.
Nope, say it ain't so.
Oh, wow. Good.
Number three is Buddy Holly. Number four is Beverly Hills. And number five is Undone, the Sweater Song.
Really? That's shocking. I wonder how much that's shocking and good. I wonder how much of a boost they've gotten in the past
Let me
months.
see Africa. Let me see. So is
I'm
that on the,
shocked. That's on the Teal album.
well, yeah, what shocks you about it?
I'm doubly shocked. I'm shocked that Africa isn't in the top five because I really felt like that is it's basically their claim to fame for their second life. Um, and I'm shocked that there's that many Blue Album songs in the top five, even though it's been around the longest, but Spotify hasn't been around that whole time. So
No.
Spotify is only collecting streams from the past 15 years, I'd say 15 to 20. But three Blue Album songs in the top five is pretty impressive. So
Yeah, and I guess that's a good note for us to end on. I wasn't able to see how many streams Africa has gotten. I'd like to in comparison, but I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that I am typically very averse to this idea that there is this sort of universal, we can make these like universal proclamations about what an artist's most definitive work is. However, there are certain glaring exceptions to that where it's like, okay, even somebody who has a hard time swallowing this idea that, this is the album and because the masses agreed on it, there's just some times where I'm like, look, like, I mean, maybe this is a bad example, but like, you're not going to get any argument from me if you say Led Zeppelin 4. You know what I mean? I mean, there's other records of theirs that I love. Um, Maybe that's a bad example because like kind of everything they've done is up there now at this point. Even when by the time I was in high school, it's like their whole fucking catalog was pretty much
yeah,
all the way at the top pushed. I don't know how that happened, but it just did.
Deep Purple's Machine Head. And I know you're not on that boat. That's not your favorite, but I think that's like people think about Deep Purple. That's the album that is like their definitive album.
Right, right, right. And I mean, I listened to it again recently. I can't really argue with that either.
Yeah,
I mean, I
it's
can't. I can't. And at this, I mean, my guys, Aerosmith, right? Like anybody off the street will tell you Rocks is and that's one of my favorite albums ever. I mean, there's other albums by them that I like almost as much. Um, so there's cases where it's like, look, just I'm not going to fight this, right? Right. When you assess the standing of the Blue Album for you as an artistic achievement compared to everything of theirs that has come since, how would you how would you say they've lived up since then?
I well, I guess it goes back to what I said very early in this conversation. Is I don't think anything they've done since has connected with me in the same way that Blue specifically and Pinkerton connected with me as a whole. The only thing that really came close was Everything Will Be All Right in the End, and the White Album. Both of those, I think, are stellar albums with great songwriting. They both feel like Weezer to me, as opposed to some other stuff that just doesn't feel like Weezer. It feels like any, I don't know. it what's the name of that freaking band? Uh, like Fall Out Boy, who they've
Mm.
collaborated with. But like, I'm not a fan of Fall Out Boy, but and some of these modern Weezer albums, I'm like, might as well be a Fall Out Boy album. I can't tell the difference. But White and Everything Will Be All Right in the End, they feel like Weezer albums. Do they connect with me in my heart the same way that Blue Album did? No. But they also landed when I was an established adult. I was 35 or whatever when those albums came on. I don't think humans absorb music the same way as an adult as you do when you're, we've had this conversation, when you're a teenager, like you are just, it's like you're walking around with giant pores all over your body that are just absorbing anything that comes at it. And you're very impressionable. It's very easy for things to get in and just kind of stick. And so, yeah, that album hit me at the absolute perfect time in my life. And there were other albums of that time that didn't make the same impact. Dookie didn't have the same lasting impact. Um, Super Unknown, I love it. I love Soundgarden, but that album didn't change my life the way the Blue Album did. Downward Spiral, like these were all albums of '94 that were just, they are all landmark albums for each of their respective bands. And even though I was 14 years old for all of them, Blue Album was the only one that really just freaking connected on every level. And nothing Weezer has done post Pinkerton did that for me. They've come close, but nothing has really matched it.
Yeah, I phrased the question poorly. Really what I'm getting at is it doesn't surprise me at all that three of their top five songs are from that record. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if kids on TikTok are doing songs from that
Mm,
era, or maybe Africa, maybe, or Rosanna, but like mostly from that era. There's, certain artists, it's like their legacy just sort of settles, right? And it's like, what's in the thumbnail of how we're going to sum that artist up for all time.
yes.
What's going to go on that in that inscription, right? On what I call the granite wall of the, Temple of Rock or whatever, like how we're going to remember Weezer, how you inscribe it in Greek letters. I wonder how many fans you've met or interacted with in like Weezer online superfan Farmville land, um, who are like, oh no, 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 I heard Ratitude at 14 and I totally loved it. Then I went back and listened to their other stuff, but Ratitude is the one that like, or whatever. How much have you encountered that?
Not at all. Partially because I'm just not interacting with that generation. People 20 to 25 years younger than me, even 15 years younger than me.
But I'm
I
sure you've
just,
seen YouTube comments and they like what uh, and you were talking to a lot of these fans back in the day, and we didn't really talk about this, the whole Maladroit thing and how he was, getting fan input again, which I thought was lame, but now I think is actually really cool. He kind of like um focus grouped the making of that record while he was making it and had fans feel like they were part of it, which is like a real, like very, very early precursor to like Kickstarter or something like that. Not that he was getting funds, but the same kind of, hey, you can have a hand in how this turns out kind of
yeah.
thing. Um, I'm just curious how many of those people are out there who would be like, yeah, yeah, I love the Blue Album, but for me, this other album hit me at a time in my life. Or whether if you got like, 50,000 Weezer fans or even a million of all different ages, is there something
Mm.
about that, the vibe of that Blue Album that like the overwhelming majority would say, man, that's the one?
I think the latter. I would be shocked if there was anybody who didn't consider the Blue Album to be their favorite Weezer album. Like anybody who's familiar with the catalog, right? Even if you are, let's say you were 14 in 2007 or whatever when Gratitude came out, and those singles came out and they connected with you, and you, well, I guess I can't say any of this definitively. Maybe they went back and listened to the Blue Album and it just didn't have the right vibe for them. It's
Right.
possible that,
It didn't personally resonate as much.
yeah, maybe they hear it and they're like, this sounds outdated. This sounds like the 90s. I'm listening to, whatever's popular now. This doesn't sound the same.
But I
Um,
think you're right in that the majority would at least recognize that there's something special, that it does stand head and shoulders. And I don't like to make those general definitive, like that is the truth statements about music. But
yeah,
there's something here in this case that it's hard to argue with.
yeah. I mean, if I do a thought experiment and I'm 14 years old and it's 1994 and I hear, I'm trying to think of any band that had been established, right? Let's say a band that started in the 1980,
Hmm.
and they were 14 years into their career and still releasing music that I was hearing for the first time. I can't really think of any band that fits that
It's
description.
not going to be Van Halen. Nobody's gonna. Nobody's gonna hear like Balance. Some people say, "Well, I love it. It's the it's the it's the stuff I first heard of theirs. It was my introduction." But they're not gonna say, "I don't connect with that earlier stuff." They might
Correct.
connect with both, right? But actually, that's a good example because the first Van Halen album is not by a long shot my favorite, not even close. And that's why people my whole life have been telling me, you're just being contrary. You're just doing that on purpose somehow. You're tricking
You're
yourself into
you're a fair warning guy, is that right? You're fair warning?
women and children first, fair
Oh yeah,
warning,
yeah, yeah.
without question. Smoke that first record. Although what I will say that I have to acknowledge is I grew up in a post Van Halen world. I did not hear Van Halen's first album in 1978 when it would have blown my you know neurons to smithereens because I hadn't heard anything like that before. I was
Yeah.
already going back into their catalog. Like when I first got into them, 1984 was out. So it, it, it doesn't sound as revolutionary to me as it would have to somebody hearing it in real time.
Mhm.
But no, it's not my favorite record by them.
Can't I can't think of any other.
I mean,
Like the
I don't, sorry to cut you off. I don't like it when music critics will just, or any kind of commentator will just offhandedly say, oh, that album shows that the band was in decline, whatever. I never do that because those albums all have their fans. But this is a case where no matter who I think on the Weezer, like where in their catalog an individual's favorite records are, I feel like the Blue Album is gonna be one of two. You know what I'm saying? It's gonna
yes,
go with whatever their other favorite record is. That's just
wherever you
my
got on
opinion.
that bus, the Blue Album will be riding on the bus with you, right? You're not gonna. I don't think anyone's gonna write it off.
Exactly. Or say, no, I just don't, even the way I'm somewhat dismissive of Van Halen's first record compared to the ones I really, 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 really love, right? I don't know that you'll get that. And I generally think that if you were to survey fan bases, you get all sorts of different answers. I think Weezer's an exception to that. Right. Like if you Mastodon, like behind you, the poster, if you asked their fans to to list their favorite records, I think you get a lot of different answers. But probably Leviathan or Blood Mountain or whatever the hell that's called. Is that what it's called?
This one is Blood Mountain.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
right. I think those two would come up a lot, but you might get for any given band, especially ones with like big, extensive catalogs, you get a bunch of different records, right? Um, yeah, Weezer is populist music, and yet it's also contrary. He's also done his share of like resisting that, which is cool. I wonder what it's like for him to know that, in a sense, his greatest work though is behind him and has been. He's always been playing catch up for since 1996. I wonder what that's like for him.
Yeah, I don't know. And the other interesting part of the whole conversation of Rivers is like he is like legitimately a student of like meditation, and he goes on these week-long retreats, and I don't know how that has changed him personally, but I do wonder if it has made him more open to allowing input from others and to be less self-critical, um, and to not let what has happened in the past affect how he's living his life currently. Um, all of these things are kind of, loosely Buddhist ideas about living in the moment and things like that.
Hmm.
I feel like it's all true to him. He is doing it for real. Like he is living those, I don't even know how to say what I'm trying to say. It's all affecting his output, in a legitimately true way. Yeah, I don't know. The
Well, I
other,
mean, I think he would say, my guess is that for him, the process, the ongoing process of continuing to write and continuing to show up at the page and write a song, that for him, it's all one flow. I think he would also say, or at least be able to tell himself, well, it's not like I stiffed after that album. I've had continuous string of, you know,
yeah,
I've hit home runs after that too, right? So, or maybe not quite home runs, but I mean, it's it'd be one thing if like nobody cared at all about the music, but he keeps tapping into something, mass consciousness in some way. You On that note, he did say when I interviewed him, because I listened to it again to edit it and tweak the sound. He did say when we were in the room with him that, there have been times when he would take total control, and then there'd be times where he's like, okay, guys, do whatever. And he's like, neither one of those was the healthiest, but that on everything will be all right in the end, there was a balance there. And, I mean, they don't seem to be slowing down at all. I know I heard a quote from Pat Wilson in like 1996, 97, saying that if the band didn't pay so well, it would be a drag and he probably wouldn't be in it. I do wonder what it's like for those guys because it looks like a job a lot of the time. As much
yeah.
as they try to make it look like rock and roll big time fun, it doesn't look like that. So
I,
I've,
I think it's a job. I think they are happy to be raking in the royalties and going out and doing a pretty big tour once a year, and then, just living their life. Like Pat Wilson is almost invisible. Like you never see him. He doesn't do social media. You kind of have no idea what he does with his life off stage or out of the studio. I think that's interesting, um, especially in this day and age where kind of everybody's just out there. Um, Brian Bell is on social media, but it doesn't look like he's doing much other than driving around in his Porsche. Like he's just seems totally content to just be a guy.
But he's got a band though.
Yeah, all of these guys have bands except for Scott Schreiner, who doesn't. Uh, I don't know what he does with his free time, but he's active on social media, and it doesn't look like he's doing much else. Like it's not like Pat Wilson is still out there recording new albums for the Special Goodness, which was his band.
What a loss.
No doubt. But
See, not to be I'm not saying this just to be contrary. I put that record and the Blue Album. But I know this is going to be sacrilegious. I have to listen to both and sit really and listen and kind of like try to turn off my prejudice. But to me, they're at least tied as far as I'm concerned. And
and
okay, I mean,
you're talking about Land Air Sea, the
yeah,
Special Goodness album.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
right. And I don't see how if you love the Blue Album, you couldn't love the shit out of Land Air Sea and hold them in sort of equal esteem. Maybe you can address that.
Um, the only thing I think that holds people back, like diehard Weezer fans, is Pat's literal voice. Like his singing voice isn't immediately accessible. Um, Rivers is a more traditional voice. Um, other than that, musically, I think it's great. It's astonishing. The lyrics are really interesting. The performances are fantastic. Like that album sounds great phonically. Um, but that when it was released, and I was deep into the Weezer internet world at that point in my life, fans did love it. Like it was popular enough that Rivers let Pat be the opening act on a tour. Like that was it. There was a fan base. Now it wasn't lasting, and maybe it wasn't lasting because it was a side project. Like Pat didn't give it all his attention. He didn't continue writing new music and releasing a lot of new albums. Um, I would never say it was tied with the Blue Album in terms of if a ranking, but I do. If I should send you the list because another Discord group I'm in, there's a Weezer discussion, and I ranked everything, like all the Weezer releases, and I mixed in the Rentals albums and the Special Goodness albums and the Relationship albums. And I think my memory is of everything. I think I had it at number 4 of all the releases. So it would be Blue and Pinkerton, which flip flopped for me on a daily basis. And then Maladroit, and then I think Land Air Sea is right there.
That's pretty
And I,
fucking high.
and I think below that, I think I had one of the Rentals albums. I don't know if it was Return to the Rentals or 7 More Minutes, but I think some top 5, that's them. And then everything else kind of falls below it. It just
Mm.
doesn't quite live up. And that is an indication of how great I think both Pat and Matt are as songwriters. Like they know how to write songs, they produce great albums. So it's a little sad that, you know, Pat in particular has kind of fallen off the radar in terms of producing his own music. Brian's music never connected with me quite the same way. I think they're okay, but I don't ever reach out to listen to them. The Relationship is his current band. It's more of a traditional Beatles influenced kind of sound that just doesn't do too much for me. Um, as a classic rock guy,
Mhm.
the Special Goodness has much more of that vibe.
Where's the Rivers to cut in and say, I think that's our time. You guys are talking about Pat.
we can't,
Okay,
you
so
can't,
that
you can't talk about the Blue Album without talking about Pat and Matt, and Brian not so much because Brian only sang on that album.
Right, he didn't play any guitar on it. He the deal was he joined while they were making it.
They were already actively in the studio with Rick when they asked Jason Cropper, the original guitarist, to leave because it was, he had gotten a girl pregnant. It was very clear that his life was about to take a very different direction. So they asked him to leave, and they Brian was the first person they thought of, and they called him, and he flew in and sang backup vocals.
What do you think he brings to the table in Weezer?
And that's a really tough question. I have a really hard time analyzing what Brian does. I think he's integral to the band. He wouldn't have stuck with them this entire 30-year arc if he didn't have something. But at the same time, I don't know if you couldn't just pluck him out and put another musician in and still get the same experience of Weezer. I hate saying that because I love Brian. I don't think he's um I have nothing bad to say about the guy, but
Well, but he plays so Rivers plays solos, but Brian will play these like little leads, correct?
yeah,
But does he do that on the records too?
yeah. What he plays live is what you're hearing on the
Okay,
records.
so those little like
Yeah, the little
um
riffs and fills.
textural licks that are
Yeah,
yeah are him. That's pretty cool. I mean, I'm not downplaying what he does, but as far as like and he does rhythms on the records too, correct?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
He contributes a lot. I just don't know if I hate it because it sounds like I'm disparaging the guy. I just don't. I just have never gotten a true sense of who Brian is.
Musically in this context, it's hard for you to put your finger on it.
Yeah, and he's really like mysterious, which is kind of cool. Like nobody really knows about Brian's personal life at all. Like usually you get some sense, especially nowadays, like what people are doing, how they're spending their
Mhm.
time. Do they have a relationship? Is
Well, stalker fucking fans like you probably drove him into hiding. He probably was like, "Fuck that! I'm glad Rivers is getting all the attention. Get the fuck out of here with this shit."
it's but it is impressive that after 30 years he can still maintain this kind of private life and be mysterious and have some mystique and um even Pat is that way to a large extent. But
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about those guys whether they view the band and Rivers in particular with a combination of feeling like, well, he's the songwriter, so he's our meal ticket, kind of. I hate to put it that way, but he's the one who makes all this go, and we're part of this machine that is so lucrative. But then on the other hand, they don't have some resentment toward it limiting what they can do otherwise. I can't speak to Brian Bell's songwriting. I can speak to Pat Wilson's songwriting. I'm shocked and delighted that you would rank that album as number 4, and that the next one is a Matt Sharp, is a Rentals
yeah,
release, which just goes to show Matt Sharp chose his creativity. He couldn't, well, I don't know exactly what went down. I did see a recent YouTube clip where even after Matt Sharp left the band, he and Rivers were hanging out though. They were like watching the World Cup or something together.
yeah, I'm sure it took a little time, but they have not had a negative relationship since leaving. They haven't collaborated, and they've never done that thing that a lot of bands do, where they, invite. No, bring it to the stage, Matt Sharp, right? Like people would lose their fucking minds if he came out to play one song.
Yeah, I don't
They've
think Rivers could handle that. I don't know,
they
but I don't think he.
they've never done it, and part of me wonders if they don't do it because Scott would be maybe super offended to be like, "Hey, Scott, I know you've been in this band for 25 years, but could you just step aside for one song like that?"
They know the fan base would fucking wet their underwear, and I don't think Rivers' ego could handle it. Although, I don't know. That's just me speculating. Once you've wrested control of a band, you don't want to open that back up. And yes, I think there's also Scott, but I also think their the buzz around it would be too much for them to ignore. It would become a story, like they say in sports,
Yes.
and it'd become a distraction to the whole team. Um, but I wonder for Pat Wilson how much he ever thinks, well, man, if I had stuck to my own muse, how much more music could I have done? Clearly, he could have done. And I wonder how he bargains with that.
Yeah. I mean, or maybe he feels like he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. Like he released the albums he did, and now he's content just being Weezer's drummer.
I
Although
mean,
he
you
did play
you
guitar.
you do get the sense that Matt Sharp feels he made the right choice,
Yes.
yeah, the right choice for him. Yeah, yeah. There isn't that sense of like, oh, I regret not being the super huge stay on the
Nope.
gravy train. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And anytime I've heard interviews with Matt in recent years, like within 2 or 3 years, he's never talked about that time in Weezer with anything but positive things to say about it. Um, he's never indicated any sort of regret for leaving, and he's also never indicated any sort of um, like longing to be back in that world. He's happy making rentals music. He's happy with the life he lives. Good
It's
for him.
probably a lot more manageable
Yeah.
than being in this giant lumbering thing. You mentioned when when we took the trip to see them in 2014 to Buffalo, I thought that everything about the interactions we had with Scott, with Rivers, and then that one glimpse of Pat showed us everything about their personalities that you'll ever need to know, kind of. You know what I mean? It's just like such the perfect, even though Pat was just a passing glimpse, like that said as much to me as half an hour talking to each of those other guys did. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So. And speaking of that, man, I mean, well, thank you so much for sharing your story with this music. I mean, the relationship with this music is extraordinary. I mean, we all have these albums that are such a profound part of our lives that it is like a relationship you have, a lifelong friendship or something. It's like the album is like a person almost. Um,
Yeah.
but
And reviewing some emails I had sent to you in the past, whatever, 10 years, I found one there where I described Pinkerton as one of the best friends I've ever had. And your response was that you were surprised that I would put it into that sort of context as, being, um, at the time, I don't think you were, I don't know. Your reply said that you were surprised or you hadn't considered putting an album in that personification of like it being somebody as you would consider a friend.
wow. So that's definitely changed
Yeah, and
since whenever that was.
that was probably at least I don't know I can look at the date, but it was at least a decade ago.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean Pinkerton is a friend. Like that's an album where you're going through a breakup and you're just not feeling well. I can put that album on and it will just it's like somebody give me a big hug, even though it's problematic in many ways lyrically, but it still feels good. Like it's a cathartic album. Um, the Blue Album just feels like home. Like it's just it takes me back to that early time in my life where I was just learning to be a musician and learning to write music and just as a 14-year-old get the whole life ahead of you. You got free time, you've got nothing to worry about. You don't have a job yet. Like all you needed to worry about was going home and putting that album on in the incorrect track order and just listening to it and playing along. And it just feels like a safe comfort blanket. Um,
Hmm.
that yeah, I don't get that from pretty much any other album.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, at that age, you have a lot of angst, but you don't realize that you have a lot of hope. There is this feeling of like your whole life being ahead of you and not really understanding what that is, but there's a brightness to that sense of possibility. It's just, or maybe we read that into it later, but it's like, man, it's like this, it's just like a blank canvas, right? What your life could be. And while you're struggling as a teenager, you don't realize that's also in the picture too. There's this like this high energy, like, yeah, yeah, we're alive. We're, right? Well, I really, really appreciate you talking about this. This uh, I think this is one of the only, maybe not, but like, this is certainly the most pronounced example of a band that has come to mean something to me because of what it means to people I love and care about. You, Rick and Scott, and it's that gives it like a nice twist for me because I don't think I would have ever. I think I would have eventually appreciated them, but it never would have felt personal.
Yeah,
And now it does, and that's great. And 30 years, man, that is astounding and terrifying to think about.
yeah. And it was, I mean, it was only 7 years old when we met. Like it was still fresh when we first met. So
Wow. That's right.
right,
Fuck. That's right. Wow. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was like not that far in the rear view.
no,
It
it's
was
like
like,
if we found an album from 2017 and we were talking about it today, it's not that far away. So it was fresh in our minds. It was fresh in our songwriting. Um, yeah, pretty unique time for us to connect initially. And then we've had this long friendship through this entire time, just seeing their career do this and go all over the place and do what it has done. Um, and thank you for having me. I'm honored that you would consider my voice valuable in any
oh,
way. But
there isn't another person on earth I'd rather talk about Weezer with. I mean, it's just without question, without question. Even like you could point me, even that guy who knows them. I mean, I'd be interested in that stuff from a different like interviewer's perspective and that kind of relationship with a band. But as far as like somebody talking about the actual music, no, 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 no. And I mean, you speak for so many people. I think that is like I cannot help but think of that band and the cul-de-sac Rick and Scott grew up on. To me, those things are, and I have a warm, like wonderful sensation of being on their street. And I know you grew up in the same town, so that is, and just going to that house, and I don't even like love the suburbs, but there's something, there is a warm glow to them. Like if you watch a Steven Spielberg movie, like E.T., one of my favorite movies, but like, you know, he presents this idealized, like the lens is literally fucking glowing, right? And I don't resonate with that so much in real life, but there is something also that I really, really have a sense of nostalgia and wistfulness for. And just picturing you guys like hammering away away on your instruments, making this music, super inspired by this one artist, Rivers Weezer, and being infused with that much hopefulness and energy and enthusiasm. And then, of course, the music we made that I worked with you guys on. That means a lot. It's a beautiful story, and one that I would have been sneering at these fucking geeks without you guys to set me straight. So, Steve, Weezer, Steve,
I'm gonna
David
go right
Bazan's,
now. I'm gonna
was
go right
that?
now and try and find that tape.
You should
I'll
send
send
me a
you a
still
picture.
shot of it if you can. Right now, David Bazan's calling you up. Steve, fuck you.
We can have the same conversation tomorrow if you want to do the David Bazan
Oh,
conversation.
we have to do that. We have to do the David Bazan conversation. Folks, also, I'll put the link in the description to my Substack post with the audio of the interviews I did back to back with Scott Schreiner and Rivers Cuomo, where Steve was there, present, right there with me. Awesome trip, awesome story, really funny, really fun, and I was surprised at how good those interviews were when I listened back to them,
Yeah, they were
and
great.
I was surprised at how much positive feeling I got from Rivers. I mean, I kind of remembered that, but listening to the specifics, because I was like sitting like right, he was like right here. We were like 2 feet apart, like next to each other on a couch. And there were some things he said that I thought were a little bit sort of the rock and roll cliche, like, oh, I'm living my dream and I appreciate this so much. But other than that, I I I really walked away from that like with an admiration for the guy that I hadn't had before. And that was the interview where I realized if ever I think I don't like somebody who's like a famous figure based on what they say or what they do or what they project, if I can sit down and talk to them, I bet you I'll fucking walk away like with a completely new appreciation for their whole thing. Because that's exactly how I felt after that. I was like, wow, this is really interesting to talk to. Really profound and like lucid thinker.
Yeah,
So I will let you go. We will do this about David Bazan. We will do a Weezer Deep Cuts
deep
episode,
dive. Yeah.
maybe with a couple of other people, maybe the gang, and yeah, for feedback. For Feedback Def, I'm Savvy Reyes Kulkarni, the apostate music journalist with the one and only Weezer Steve. Oh shit. Next time we'll ask him to show us the binders. The
I've got him.
laminated binders. I didn't even mention that shit, but Steve has laminated binders of all the little geekazoid printouts from the all the message board messages and stuff. Thank God you do, man. Thank
They're
God you had the
gone.
foresight to do that because that stuff is
Yep.
can't go on Wayback Machine and find that stuff.
No, you can't. They're gone. I don't have it all, but I've got the stuff that's meaningful to me.
You've
So
got enough.
I'm glad.
You should send
Thanks.
some of that to the band.
Eh, I get the feeling Rivers would be embarrassed by the
Like,
way he
go to Steve's
acted.
house and break into that shit and steal those binders. I think that's your time for those binders, Steve.
Yep, 100%.
All right.
Hey, thanks for having me. I
Sure,
appreciate it.
man. I'll let you go. We'll talk soon.
Yeah.